Welcome to Chapter 4, and this is Part 1. There are two parts to this presentation. One, we're going to look at applying overhead using the plant-wide and departmental method for allocating overhead. And in Part 2, we're going to look at ABC costing as a method of applying overhead. So again, we have three methods that can be used. One is to do one rate, which is for the whole plant. Another is to do by department, and the other is to use what we call ABC costing. And then the last thing we look at and we go over is just-in-time approach to inventory. And what just-in-time is about is you keep the minimum amount of inventory so that you don't have a high inventory level, and you just, when you get orders, you order. Now, overhead allocation. We have plant-wide, we use one rate. Now, this works well if departments use overhead equally. Now, if you have departments that use overhead differently, then you probably want to use department overhead rates, where you collect the cost, the indirect cost for each department, and then they come up with a basis as to how they're going to apply it. And then the last is ABC costing. Again, since your attempt is to try to get the cost as close to the end product as possible, ABC costing is a more refined method. However, it's a lot more work. And we cover that in Part 2. So plant-wide overhead is we're going to use one rate to allocate. The cost objective, again, is the unit of cost. The allocation can be labor hours, labor dollars, or machine hours, but you can only use one. And the way you're going to determine it is, again, you're going to take the budget that you establish at the beginning of the year divided by the budgeted allocation base that you establish at the beginning of the year. So remember, to come up with the rate, you're using the annual estimated overhead costs and the annual estimated usage. And then the same rate is going to apply to all products, and this is what it looks like. So your overhead costs will be collected in one place, and we'll come up with a basis, and then we'll apply it based on that usage for each product. So we're going to, again, to come up with the rate, we're going to take that budgeted overhead cost divided by the budgeted overhead base. Budgeted allocation base. So let's take a look at a problem. All right, in this case, we have plant-wide overhead. Now, the first thing I always do is whenever I address a problem, I look at what am I trying to do and what information do I need to solve it. And I write down that information. So we have an overall for the year. At the beginning of the year, we budget that overhead is going to be $400,000, and we have the option of using machine hours or direct labor hours. So now we're going to compute our plant-wide overhead rate. Now, if we do it by machine hours, it's going to be $20 an hour for the every time you use the machine. And if we do direct labor hours, it's going to be $80. But you can remember, you can only use one. You can't use both. So we have a job, and it used 100 machine hours and 50 direct labor hours. So let's do it based on each of the methods. So if we allocate based on machine hours, we'd allocate $2,000 in overhead. And if we did it by labor hours, we would allocate $4,000. Now, which is correct? It depends. What drives our costs? Now let's look at department overhead rates. This is what that looks like. We take the overhead and we estimate how much is for each department. Each department comes up with what they consider the best cost driver, i.e. labor hours, labor dollars, or machine hours. And we use that as a basis to allocate the cost every time that particular base is used for each of the products. Now, departmental overhead rates. Use this method if departments incur different amounts and types of overhead. First, we're going to estimate the total overhead costs incurred in each department for the upcoming year. Then they're going to select an allocation base for each department. Now, it can be, again, labor hours, machine hours, or labor dollars, depending on what they think drives the costs. Then they're going to come up with the overhead rate based on the department's overhead cost divided by the allocation base. And then we're going to allocate it based on actual usage of that particular base. So now let's take a look at a problem. Here is a problem that we have. Again, in this case, we have total plant-wide overhead costs of $1,000,001. That is divided between Department M and Department F. We have plant-wide direct labor hours, and then we have machine hours, which will be the cost driver for Department M, and we have labor hours, which will be the cost driver for Department F. And then 2 jobs were completed, and this is what the actual usage was. So, but first, what we got to do is, we know what the costs are. So, what we have to do is come up with the rate. So, for overall plant-wide overhead, it'd be $40 for every direct labor hour. Now, what about our department overhead rates? Well, for Department M, since we're using machine hours, it'd be $50. And for Department F, it would be direct labor hours. So now we have all of our rates. So how much would be applied to each department based on plant-wide or departmental overhead? So plant-wide, it would be, and that's how I get the hours. So for job 110, I had 1 hour for Department 1 and 4 hours for Department F for job 110. And then I did also the same for job 115. Now, what about if we did it by department? By department, we would end up with applied overhead for job 110 of 180, and for job 115, it would be 410. Now, that's quite a difference. So, if we believe that the overhead by department is a more accurate reflection of applying overhead, what would end up happening is job 110 would be overcosted by $20 if we use plant-wide, and job 115 would be undercosted by $210 if we used plant-wide. So these are the kind of things you have to think about, because the closer you get to the cost driver, the better you determine the true cost of the item you manufacture, because the truth is you want to figure out when you manufacture multiple items, which one, where are you making your money? And by using, if you can push down that overhead cost as close to the product as possible based on the cost driver, the better picture you're going to get of what's going on. So, assessing plant-wide and departmental overhead methods. The strength is you have readily available information like direct labor or machine hours. It's easy to implement and comply with GAAP, can be used for external reporting. The weakness is overhead cost is often too complex to be explained by factors like direct labor, hours, or machine hours. So, it's easy, but it's not the best way to get the cost to the actual, what's actually generating the cost. So why and how do companies refine their costing? They use ABC costing. It is more precise. It reduces cost distortion to a minimum, focuses on activities as cost objectives. Indirect costs are allocated based on types of activities and to the extent to which these activities are used. Same basic steps as departmental cost allocation, except based on activity. And the truth is, it's a lot more work to do it. You probably do it if you were a large manufacturer and you produce various products that use various amounts of overhead, or processes, because that's what it focuses on, processes. So that ends part 1.